Hello everyone, thank you for coming to my presentation. We're going to be going through a lot of material in a very little period of time, so I may be rushing a bit, but you can feel free to stop and ask me questions at the end if you want. So today we're going to be talking about grammar, the pros and cons of teaching grammar within the classroom. You may be wondering why that's even a debate, why that's a question, but it actually is a hotly debated topic among people in the language arts communities. So first I want to start by asking you a question. What do you think? When I say we're going to study grammar, what kind of feelings does that bring up? And before you answer that question, specifically what words would you use to describe grammar and the feeling you get thinking about the study of grammar? What words would you use? You can write some down. I'll give you about 10-15 seconds to think of a few words. Okay, so let me hear some of your answers.
Complicated. How one word can mean one thing one time and mean something else a different time.
Okay, what are some other words? Just shout them out.
Essential.
Essential. What other words?
Boring.
Okay, other words.
Important.
Important.
Necessary for an educated person.
Necessary. Okay, any other things? All right, so there's usually a range, and probably if I were to talk to my 7th grade students, I would get some different answers. Actually, I know I would. They often give me different answers, like, this is boring, there's no need to learn grammar. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your opinion, they resound something that already is being talked about within the community. So I want to first start by defining what grammar is. Grammar is a set of rules that explains how a system operates in a language, specifically focusing on 3 areas: syntax, morphology, and semantics. So syntax is how words are arranged, the arrangement of words and phrases within something to create a sentence. Morphology is the development of a word. How did a word come to be? And then syntax is, or semantics is, how do we use these phrases and how do we use these words within a sentence and what meaning do they have? So understanding what grammar is brings us to the debate in grammar. We need to understand that there are 2 different types of grammar that we're talking about. There's descriptive grammar and prescriptive grammar, 2 very different things. Descriptive grammar is simply looking at what something has been written or what someone has said and analyzing it. Why did they write it the way that they wrote it? What does this mean? That's not really a debated topic. So when we're talking about the debate of whether grammar should be taught, we're talking about prescriptive grammar, which is telling you how to write, how to speak, how the English language is formed before you even get to the process of writing. So at the very early years of your studies, all the way up through higher education. So prescriptive grammar is primarily, when we're saying grammar, that's what I'm talking about, prescriptive grammar. So here's some of the arguments against grammar inclusion. And when I say grammar inclusion, you can't eliminate grammar from language arts curriculums altogether. It's just a necessary part because it's the building block of our language. But we're often debating whether or not it should be its own separate entity within language arts studies. Should we take time out of our curriculum to study it? So here's 4 arguments against that I found in the articles that I read. The first is the constant debate. So because people are having a difficult time even defining the grammar that we're talking about, because they're having a difficult time choosing which ways grammar should be presented, it often is so debated that we never come to any conclusions. Therefore, it brings us to the second problem, which is teachers' opinions. Teachers then sense this debate and this confusion, and they're left confused. They're left to wonder, what is grammar relevance exactly? How am I supposed to teach it? Do I teach it at all? Is it something that I take time in my classroom to do? Which then brings us to the third argument against, which is curriculum. Language arts, or any topic that you could ever teach, is so broad. You have such a limited amount of time to teach the amount of information you're covering. So in curriculum, you have this inadequate time to fill in the gaps with grammar. You have so much to read, you have so much writing to implement, creative writing, essay writing, that we often end up having grammar just be something that falls into those categories as opposed to its own entity, simply because it's not in our core standards as obviously as some of these other standards are, and it falls to the wayside. The 4th one is a little separate from the first 3, and that's creativity. In one of the studies that was shown, there were many people who believed grammar to be a hindrance to creativity. I'm actually going to argue the opposite when I move to the next category of arguments. But on this side, this person specifically, a writer, said that they are a creative agent rather than just functionally literate. When they're forced to take time out of their writing classes to study grammar, they're not allowed that creative time and that creative flow to develop some other types of writing. And so that's one argument that, although not as common as the first three, is seen in arguments opposed to grammar inclusion as its own entity within language arts. So let me move on to the arguments for grammar inclusion. And I picked 4. There are countless, just like there are countless against. But I picked the 4 strongest that I think overarch all the topics within grammar. The first is foreign language. So in foreign language studies, how many of you have ever taken a foreign language course? So if you have, you know how difficult that can be. Just in general, learning a language that you've never heard, sometimes trying sounds you never have with your mouth, that can be difficult alone. But then you have your teacher talking about the verb in Spanish goes after the noun, and you have certain types of past participles and present participles and the tenses that they're in. And if you don't know grammar, those words are also foreign to you. It's as if you're learning 2 separate languages, the grammar language and the foreign language, which can make it exceedingly difficult. There were unending articles that showed the link between learning foreign languages with people who have studied grammar. Most of the studies on grammar were done in other countries based on this. Then writing discussion. So if Jimmy hands me in a paper and I say to Jimmy, this is a fragment. You only have a noun and a few adjectives. If Jimmy's never learned grammar and its terms on its own, that sentence makes no sense to him. He knows I've said this isn't a good enough sentence, but he doesn't understand why it's bad to only have a noun and a couple of adjectives, or even what a noun and adjectives are. When I say you need to include a verb, does he know what a verb is to know how to include them and why they need to be used? Therefore, if I'm going to teach writing in any way, or even just creative writing, they need to understand basic structures of the language. The third is creativity. So if you remember, we argued against grammar inclusion because of creativity and the perception that it quelches creativity. But there's an argument to the other side that says this: you have to know the rules to break the rules. So most of the famous authors, poets especially, break all types of grammar rules. Prescriptive grammar doesn't always fall into place with what they wrote, but it's intentional and it helps to add to what they did. If it was not intentional, it wouldn't have the same effect. So they have to understand what the rules are in order to break them strategically. So it actually can enhance creativity in so many ways. Which brings me to my very last point, which is Bloom's taxonomy. If you're in the education world, you've heard of Bloom's taxonomy. If not, it's a representation of human cognitive function or human cognition. So if you start at the bottom, that's the most basic level of remembering, understanding, applying. It moves all the way up to creating, which is supposed to be the optimum level of cognition. If you're able to create, that means you've mastered all the skills below it. Well, one of the arguments that you can say is that the representation of these skills within the middle is breaking apart something, putting it back together, and then developing it on your own. That's what grammar does within language arts. It breaks apart the language in which you are speaking. It breaks apart the information, it categorizes it, it labels it, which is in all of these categories, and then helps you put it back together effectively. It gives you the rules and the tools and the equipment to do so. So those 4 arguments, I believe, are strong for grammar inclusion as its own entity, because understanding grammar and taking time aside within the curriculum is essential for each of these 4 things to come about, especially Bloom's taxonomy of being able to create writing on your own or understand the literature as it functions. Thank you for coming. How much time was it? This phone